Itaewon was already busy when Ray stepped onto the street. Music spilled out from open doors, mixing with traffic and voices. People moved past each other without stopping, cutting across the sidewalk, or forming short lines outside entrances. Lights from the signs caught briefly on faces and glass, then disappeared as people passed through it. Jiho kept walking. He stayed just far enough ahead to set the direction, lifting a hand once without turning back. Sungil reacted to someone calling his name. Another stepped in close, hand already on his arm. Sungil turned into it, smiling, answering without slowing down. Ray followed a step behind. The entrance didn't stand out. A narrow doorway, a short line, someone familiar at the front. Jiho reached him first. "You're here tonight," he said, already stepping past the rope. The man smiled and lifted it. "Only when you guys show up." Sungil ducked under with a laugh. Ray passed last. The exchange finished before he reached the door. Inside, the music pressed closer. The lighting shifted across the room without settling, catching faces just long enough to register before moving on. Jiho moved through it without hesitation. He touched someone's shoulder, said something quick. People adjusted around him without needing direction. Sungil stopped as soon as there was space. He leaned into the first person who reached him, greeting him with both hands, then pulled another end briefly before letting him go. His voice carried just enough to be heard, placed where it needed to land. A couple of guys approached Ray. One leaned in to speak. Another rested a hand against the table as he talked. Ray answered without shifting, and the exchange ended as easily as it started. He let his attention move on. A table along the side opened as someone stood. Jiho angled toward it without asking. Sungil followed. Ray took the remaining seat with his back to the wall, the room spreading out in front of him. A server stepped in before they looked up. Jiho ordered without checking the menu. Sungil added something halfway through. The server nodded and moved on. Ray looked across the room. Jiho stood again before the drinks arrived. Someone had already caught his eye. He crossed the space and started speaking before he stopped moving. Sungil watched him go, then leaned back, one arm resting along the back of his chair. "He's not even trying tonight," Ray said. Sungil reached across the table and picked up Ray's glass, taking a drink before realizing it wasn't his. Ray looked toward the group Jiho had joined. People turned toward him without delay. A hand landed on Sungil's shoulders. Sungil turned into it, already smiling, pulling him closer to hear him. The guy laughed before Sungil finished. Sungil let him go and turned back to the table, lifting his glass. "Same people," he said, taking a sip. Ray followed his glance across the room. "It's always the same people." "You guys said that last week," Jiho said. He leaned in long enough to take a sip, his attention already shifting past them. Sungil caught him lightly by the wrist. "Stay for a minute." Jiho didn't pull away, but he didn't settle either. His weight stayed angled toward the room. Ray looked at him. "He's not staying." Jiho smiled. "I am," briefly. A group passed beside them. One of them leaned in without hesitation, resting a hand on Sungil's shoulder as he spoke. Sungil turned, listened, then answered with a low comment that made the guy grin before moving on. Ray watched it happen, then let it go. Jiho had already moved again. He stopped near another group. Sungil leaned back, one arm resting along the back of his chair. "You see that?" he said, nodding toward Jiho. "He doesn't even finish conversations." Ray glanced over. "Well, he doesn't need to." Sungil smiled, but his attention didn't stay there. Sungil turned slightly in his seat, his knee brushing Ray's under the table. "You're quiet tonight," he said. Ray looked at him. "Am I?" Sungil held his gaze for a moment. Closer now. Ray didn't move. The table held for a moment, not empty, just quieter as the people moving in and out shifted elsewhere, pulled toward the center of the room or into other conversations. Sungil turned in his chair, angling toward Ray instead of the room. "You're still on that?" he said. Ray looked at him. On what? Sungil didn't answer right away, holding his gaze long enough to make the direction clear. Bali. Ray reached for his glass, lifted it, then set it back down without drinking. Sungil watched the movement. There was a trip. Then what? Sungil said. You came back and forgot how to move. Ray looked past him toward the room, then back again. It's not that. Then what is it? Ray rested his hand against the side of his glass. Just this guy I met there. He said it without emphasis. Sungil leaned back, studying him. And who is this guy? Ray didn't answer. Sungil let out a short breath through his nose, something close to a laugh. That's not you, he said. You don't stay on things like that. Ray didn't react. Silence means it's done, Sungil said. And you know that. Ray glanced down at the table, then back up. Yeah. Sungil picked up his glass, took a sip, then set it down again. You'll forget it. Give it a week. Ray didn't argue. Jiho stepped back into the space beside the table, catching the end of it as he pulled a chair in and dropped into it, one arm settling along the back. Are we talking about the Bali boy? He said, looking between them. Ray didn't answer. Sungil leaned back slightly. Jiho held it for a moment, then nodded. All right. He reached for his glass, finished what was left, then set it down again. Then I'll set something up next week. Ray looked at Jiho but didn't speak. There's someone you should meet, he said, not looking directly at Ray. Sungil glanced at him first. Already? Jiho gave a small shrug. Why not? Sungil leaned back, one arm settling along the back of Ray's seat. I met someone too. Jiho didn't look at him. You always do. His name is Do-yoon. He's around. Works nearby. Sungil shifted slightly, his knee brushing Ray's. Ray turned his glass once against the table before speaking. What does he do? Consulting, Jiho said. Something like that. Sungil let out a quiet breath through his nose. That sounds boring. Jiho nudged him lightly, and Sungil caught his wrist without looking, turning it just enough to stop the movement before letting it go. Jiho pulled his hand back. All right. He looked at Ray then, briefly, but Ray didn't answer. I'll bring him next weekend, Jiho said. Group night. Sungil nodded. I'll bring Daniel too. Jiho glanced at him. If he shows up. Sungil gave a small nod, already letting it go. Ray stayed quiet, turning his glass once more before looking at Sungil. Jiho exhaled and stood, not looking at them again. The conversation around the table continued as someone stepped closer to fill the space he left. And Sungil turned to answer without pause, already pulled into something else. Jiho crossed the room without slowing, stopping only when someone stepped into his path. The music pushed louder. More people moved toward the center, pulling others with them. Sungil stood. I'm not sitting all night, he said. He looked at Ray once. Come if you want. Ray nodded but stayed where he was. Sungil didn't wait. Someone caught his hand as he passed, and he let himself be pulled into the crowd, turning briefly to say something that didn't carry over the music. Jiho stood a few steps away, angled into another conversation as the man in front of him leaned in to hear him, one hand resting lightly against Jiho's arm. Jiho said something short, then listened, his attention fixed without shifting. The exchange didn't last long. Jiho adjusted his stance, closing the distance between them, and the other man didn't hesitate. A few minutes later, Jiho returned to the table without sitting. The man was with him now, close enough that their shoulders touched. Jiho's hand resting along the back of his neck, not holding him there, just placed. I'm heading out, Jiho said. Sungil glanced up briefly, then back to the person beside him. Already, Jiho gave a small shrug. Yeah. No one asked anything else. Ray looked at the man beside him, and Jiho followed the glance without turning his head. See you, he said. Then he stepped away. The man moved with him without needing to be led. Jiho's hand shifting briefly at his back as they crossed the room, guiding him through the crowd. and by the time they reached the door, they were already in step. Sungil watched them go, then let out a short breath. Consistent. Ray didn't answer. Inside the cafe, the noise stayed low, cups touching the table, chairs shifting, voices carrying without rising. Jiho came straight from work. Do-yoon and Minjae were already seated. Jiho stepped in without slowing, and Do-yoon looked up first, Minjae following a moment later. As they exchanged a quick greeting, Jiho took the seat across from them, setting his phone on the table before glancing at their drinks, and then back at them. "I'm not staying long," he said. Minjae lifted his glass slightly, but Jiho didn't respond to it, leaning back just enough to ease out of his shoulders as his attention settled on Do-yoon. "You free this weekend?" "Yeah, Saturday," Do-yoon said. Jiho nodded once. "We're out in Itaewon, group night. I want to introduce you to Ray." Do-yoon held his gaze. "That works." Minjae watched the exchange, then leaned forward slightly. "You're setting him up?" Jiho didn't answer, and Minjae leaned back again. "Ray just got back from Bali," he said. "He travels a lot." Do-yoon nodded, taking it in before looking at Minjae. "Didn't your boyfriend go there?" Minjae looked at him for a second. Then his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen and picked it up as he stood. "Yeah," he said. "Hold on." He stepped away, answering before he reached the door. Jiho didn't follow him, his attention returning to Do-yoon. "Saturday," he said. Then he stood. "See you there." Do-yoon gave a small nod. "Yeah, see you." Jiho picked up the phone and stepped away from the table. Outside, Minjae was still on the call. By the weekend, the room filled in early, voices overlapping instead of carrying as the music pushed louder, forcing people closer to hear each other. The table Jiho had used before was already half taken. Jiho crossed the floor first, stopping briefly at the bar before turning toward the table. And Ray followed without needing to look for it. Do-yoon was already there. "You made it," Jiho said. Do-yoon nodded. "Of course." Jiho didn't sit. "Give me a minute." He turned away before either of them answered. The space held enough for Do-yoon to glance at the open spot beside him, then at Ray. "You can take this," he said, shifting slightly. Ray stepped in and sat, their shoulders lining up with the edge of the table, close enough that neither needed to adjust. Do-yoon looked around once, then back. "You come here often?" "Enough." Do-yoon nodded once. The conversation stayed simple, work coming up briefly before dropping, a few names passing between them, people they both knew or had seen. Do-yoon asked questions without pressing, and when Ray answered, he listened without looking away. Sungil arrived a few minutes later, pulling Danielle in with him. "This is Danielle," Sungil said. Danielle nodded once. Ray returned it. Do-yoon did the same. Someone pulled a chair closer. Another leaned in from the side. The group closed in. The conversation widened without changing tone. Sungil carried most of it, shifting between people and picking up threads before they dropped, while Danielle spoke when addressed, his voice even, his attention steady. Jiho passed through the table once, adding something quick before moving on again. "What do you usually do on weekends?" Do-yoon asked. Ray looked back at Do-yoon. "This?" Do-yoon smiled slightly. "That makes sense." He didn't ask anything else. Glasses shifted, replaced, moved again. Across the table, Sungil said something that made someone laugh. His hand lifted briefly to brush their arms as he spoke. Ray stayed where he was, and each time the focus narrowed, it returned to Do-yoon. Nothing needed adjusting. Danielle turned slightly when someone approached from behind, waiting until the man stepped fully into the edge of the group before reaching back, his hand landing briefly at his arm. "You made it." Lucas nodded once. There wasn't much room left, so Sungil pulled a chair closer with his foot and shifted his leg to make space. Danielle thanked him. "This is Lucas," he said. Lucas stepped in and sat. An introduction passed quickly. When his gaze reached Ray, It held for a moment. Ray nodded once. The conversation continued without pause. Sungil picked it back up, turning slightly toward Lucas. You come out here often? Lucas shook his head. No, not really. Sungil gave a small smile. That explains. Lucas didn't ask what he meant. Do-yoon glanced toward him briefly, then looked back at Ray. How's the whiskey? Do-yoon leaned forward just enough to be heard. Across the table, Lucas lifted his glass and took a slow drink, then set it down without saying anything. Ray noticed it. His hand stayed on his glass, turning it once against the table. Ray's gaze moved once between them, then settled back on Do-yoon. Sungil glanced around the table, then pushed his chair back. Now that everyone's here, let's dance. He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for Danielle's hand and pulled him up. Danielle stood without hesitation, following as Sungil turned toward the floor, already moving. The space shifted around the table. Do-yoon picked up his glass, then set it back down. I'm stepping out for a smoke, he said. Ray nodded once. Lucas rested his hand near his glass. You don't smoke? He asked. Ray shook his head once. Lucas glanced toward the door, then back. Your boyfriend's going to be lonely out there. Ray looked at him. He's not my boyfriend. Lucas held it for a second, then gave a small nod. Right. He shifted slightly, closing the space between them without making it obvious. Ray didn't move. Their shoulders lined up with the edge of the table, close enough now that neither needed to adjust. Lucas glanced down. Whiskey. Ray followed his gaze to the glass in his hand. Lucas lifted his own. Same. Ray looked at him, just for a moment. Then he picked up his glass up. A small tilt. They clinked. Ray's mouth curved, barely there. Lucas took a sip, then set the glass back down, his attention staying where it was. The door opened. Do-yoon stepped back in, brushing past someone at the entrance before the space closed again behind him. His gaze landed on the table, on them. He didn't pause. Shall we? He said, nodding toward the floor. Ray looked at him, then at Lucas. They moved toward the floor, the crowd opening just enough before closing again. Ray stayed half a step behind before falling into line. The music carried over them as they disappeared into it. Some nights held longer than others. Some conversations stayed, others didn't. Jiho moved through it the same way he moved through everything else, never staying long enough to be part of what remained. Sungil kept the room together whenever it needed it. Ray stayed longer than he expected to, long enough to see what held, long enough to know what didn't. In the end, nothing needed to be decided. The pattern settled on its own. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End, Chapter 1, The Pattern. Ray stood just off the set, checking the monitor as the last frame settled into place, while the model adjusted his sleeves under the light. Hold that, Ray said, lifting the camera again, without stepping forward, then taking 2 more shots before lowering it. The stylist moved in to fix the collar, and Ray watched through the screen for a second longer before turning slightly toward the table behind him. Let's reset once, he said, setting the camera down and reaching for his phone without looking at it right away. Someone asked a question about the next look, and Ray answered while unlocking the screen, glancing up once to check the model's position before typing. You free this weekend? Saturday? He sent it without reading, then placed the phone face down beside the monitor as the stylist stepped back. Ray picked up the camera up again, adjusting the angle with a small shift of his wrist before shooting through the next sequence without speaking. The shots landed cleanly, and he lowered the camera. Good, Ray said, stepping back. His phone buzzed once against the table. Ray reached for it as someone walked past, brushing his shoulder lightly, and glanced at the screen. Saturday works. Ray read it once, then typed a short reply. Let's do noon. He set the phone down again. A message thread lit up below it before the screen dimmed. Last week was a mess. Too many people. Ray picked up the phone up again. Another message came in. It was fine. Keep the same. Ray's thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second, then moved away without typing. He locked the screen and placed the phone back down, turning toward the set as the next look came in. "Let's go," he said, lifting the camera again as the room shifted back into place around him. Sungil stood at the edge of the mat, arms crossed as he watched the line reset in front of him, while one of the younger students adjusted his stance. "Feet," Sungil said, stepping forward and tapping the outside of the boy's ankle with his foot, then shifting it into place before stepping back. The boy followed the correction, lifting his guard a second later as Sungil nodded once. Again, the group moved together, a row of kicks landing out of sync before Sungil raised a hand to stop them. "Not like that," he said, walking down the line and catching one student lightly at the shoulder to turn his body. "You're leaning." He demonstrated once, slow and controlled. They moved again, tighter this time. Sungil watched without speaking, his eyes moving from one to the next as he adjusted two more positions with quick, precise touches before stepping out of the line. A phone buzzed against the bench behind him. Sungil glanced over, then walked past it without picking it up, as one of the older students missed the timing. "Reset," he said, clapping once. They shifted back into place. Sungil stepped back, scanning the line once more as they moved through the sequence again. The phone buzzed a second time. Sungil held the line a second longer, then stepped away and walked to the bench, picking up his phone as he wiped his hands on a towel. He unlocked it and opened the message thread near the top. "Do you want to meet again this week? See you Saturday." His thumb hovered over the keyboard for a second before moving away. Another student called out from the mat. "Coach?" Sungil locked the screen and set the phone down, turning back immediately. He stepped in, repositioning the student's stance with both hands, then straightened and looked across the group. "Line up," he said, clapping once. "From the top." They moved through the sequence again. Sungil walked the line, adjusting shoulders, correcting balance. The rhythm tightened. Ray slowed near the railing, pulling one earbud out as he came to a stop. His breathing stilled uneven, while he rested his hands briefly on his hips. He straightened after a second and checked his watch, tapping the screen once before looking up. Do-yoon stood a few steps away, already facing him. His gaze moved once over Ray. Running shoes, damp shirt, then settled. "I thought this was lunch," Do-yoon said. Ray glanced down at himself, then back up. "Sorry, been busy all week. I had to run." Do-yoon nodded once. "It's fine. You want to grab coffee?" Ray asked. Do-yoon gave a small nod. "There's a place I like," he said, turning toward the path. Ray fell in to step beside him. They walked without adjusting pace, Do-yoon slightly ahead for a step before matching him. "You shoot this week?" Do-yoon asked. "Yep," Ray said. "Quite busy, huh?" Ray shrugged lightly. The cafe sat just off the main path, narrow entrance with a few tables outside. Do-yoon stepped in first, holding the door just long enough before letting it fall close behind them. They moved up to the counter. "What do you want?" Do-yoon asked. "Black," Do-yoon ordered, then stepped aside as they waited. Ray leaned lightly against the counter. "The gang is out tonight," Ray said. "Itaewon." Do-yoon held his gaze for a second, then glanced briefly down again. Shoes, shirt, before looking back up. "You're gonna change, right?" "Yeah, I'll come by," he said. Ray nodded once. Their drinks were set down between them. Do-yoon picked his up first and turned toward the seating area. Ray took his and followed. They chose a table near the window. Do-yoon sat first. Ray pulled a chair out and sat across from him, setting his cup down before leaning back slightly. Do-yoon took a sip, then lowered the cup. "You usually run in the morning?" he asked. "Whenever I can," Ray said. Do-yoon nodded once, his attention staying there. Ray lifted his cup, taking a sip before setting it back down, his hand remaining around it. Do-yoon held his gaze a moment longer. "You usually keep a set schedule?" he asked. Not really. Just whenever fits. And the runs? When I have time. The cup set between them had finished. Do-yoon reached for his. You should shower, he said. Ray looked at him. Do-yoon leaned forward slightly, resting his forearm on the table. I'll come join for the run next time. You can show me the route. Ray smiled. Yeah. The crowd gathered outside, but Jiho didn't slow. He stepped past the rope as it lifted before he reached it, moving through without stopping. Sungil followed close behind. Ray came in last, the door closing behind him as the sound tightened, and the room opened in front of him. Jiho was already inside, pulled into a group near the center, one hand resting briefly at someone's shoulder as he leaned in to speak. Sungil didn't stop when someone reached for him. A hand caught his arm as he stepped in, and he pulled free with a quick smile, nodding once without slowing. Daniel sat where the space opened, one arm resting along the back of his chair. Sungil stepped in beside him, his hand landing briefly at Daniel's shoulder as he leaned in to speak. Daniel turned slightly to hear him, then answered without shifting his position. Sungil stayed there. He didn't turn when someone called his name again from behind. Ray stopped at the bar. He rested his hand against the counter, waiting as the bartender moved down the line. Lucas stood a few steps away, finishing his drink before stepping over, stopping beside him without looking for space. Ray glanced at him. The bartender stepped in. What can I get you? Whiskey, Ray said. The bartender nodded and moved off. Ray leaned his elbow against the counter, his body angled slightly toward Lucas. How have you been? Ray asked. Lucas looked out toward the room, then back. Same as the last time. The drinks were set down in front of them. Ray picked his up first. Lucas did the same. At the table, Sungil leaned in again, his hand resting briefly at the back of Daniel's chair. As he spoke, his attention fixed there. Daniel answered, his posture unchanged, his voice low as the conversation stayed between them. Jiho stepped away from the group he was in. He crossed the space, slowing for a moment as his gaze landed on the bar. Ray and Lucas stood side by side, glasses in hand, neither leaning in, neither pulling away. Jiho watched it for a second, then turned his head as someone called him from the opposite side. He changed direction immediately. Ray lifted his glass again, taking another sip. Lucas rested his hand near the edge of the counter. They stayed where they were as the room filled in around them, the table holding behind them, while the music pressed louder. Ray kept his place at the bar, his glass set just in front of him as he watched the room once before settling again. Lucas stood beside him, one hand resting near the edge of the counter, his drink untouched for a moment. A group shifted behind them, someone reaching across the bar before moving away. The space opening again. Ray turned slightly. So, you're here for a holiday? Lucas shook his head once. I live here. Sorry. I thought you were traveling. I'm half Korean, half Australian. Ray glanced at him, then nodded again. You come out much? Lucas shook his head once. Not really. Ray nodded. The music pushed louder as more people moved in, the space tightening around them before opening again as someone stepped away. At the table, Sungil leaned closer to Daniel, his hand catching Daniel's wrist briefly as he spoke, then releasing it as Daniel answered without changing position. Lucas followed the movement for a second, then spoke. Looks like he found someone. Ray watched it for a second, then lifted his glass. Maybe. He didn't look back toward the table again. The door opened again, letting in a brief cut of outside noise before it closed. Do-yoon moved through the room without stopping, his pace steady as he passed one group and then another, his attention fixed ahead. He reached the bar and stopped just behind Ray. You got here first. Ray turned, meeting him without stepping back. Yeah. Do-yoon nodded once, then looked toward the counter. What are you having? Whiskey. Do-yoon gave a small nod. I'll go for same. The bartender stepped in and set another glass down in front of him before moving away. Do-yoon picked it up, taking a short sip before lowering it. Lucas stayed where he was. Do-yoon glanced at him once, then back to Ray. Jiho stepped out from the group he had been in, moving toward the bar. He slowed as his gaze landed on the three of them. He watched it for a second, then stepped in. "Come," Jiho said, already turning. Ray pushed off the counter first. Do-yoon followed without hesitation. Lucas picked his glass up and moved with them. Jiho reached the table and pulled a chair back with his foot, setting the space as he moved. "Everyone sit," he said. Ray took the seat between Lucas and Do-yoon. Lucas sat on one side, placing his glass down without adjusting closer. Do-yoon took the other, turning slightly toward Ray as he settled. Sungil stayed close to Danielle, shifting just enough to hold his place beside him, his attention still fixed there. Danielle turned slightly to hear him. Jiho remained standing for a moment, looking over the table. Someone called his name from across the room. Jiho didn't turn. He pulled the chair back and sat, his attention settling on the table as the space around them continued to move. Do-yoon leaned in slightly, his attention already on Ray. "You busy tomorrow?" "I have a shoot." Do-yoon held his gaze. "We can meet after." Ray looked at him. "Maybe." Do-yoon nodded once, accepting it. On Ray's other side, Lucas picked his glass up and took a slow drink, setting it back down in the same place. Ray glanced once toward him, then back to Do-yoon. Jiho watched from his seat, his gaze moving across the table once before he leaned back slightly. "Lucas," he called. Lucas turned his head. Jiho lifted his glass slightly. "Come. You feel lucky today?" Lucas looked at him for a second, then nodded once. "Yeah." Jiho's mouth curved slightly. "Do you see anyone interesting?" "Maybe." He pushed his chair back and stood. Ray watched the movement without turning his body, his gaze following just long enough before returning. Do-yoon was still speaking. Ray answered. Jiho and Lucas moved into the crowd, disappearing into the shifting space as the table held its shape. Jiho moved through the crowd without slowing, one hand brushing past the shoulder as he stepped into another group, already mid-conversation by the time Lucas stopped beside him. Lucas stayed a step behind, glass in hand. Jiho leaned in, said something quick, then shifted as another voice reached him from the side. A hand caught his arm. Jiho turned. The guy was already close, speaking near his ear. Jiho listened just long enough, then stepped back. He was already turning before the guy answered. Lucas watched without moving. Jiho reached for his glass, took a short drink, then set it down again as his gaze moved across the room. Lucas followed for a step, then stopped, letting him move ahead. Jiho slowed as he approached, his attention settling on someone at the edge. "Hey," Jiho said, leaning in just enough to be heard. The guy turned. Jiho held his gaze a second, then smiled once. "Stay with me," Jiho said. The guy didn't move away. Jiho turned his head once, checking the room behind him. Table still in place. Ray seated next to Do-yoon, Sungil still close to Danielle. He looked back. Lucas wasn't there anymore. Jiho didn't search for him. The table settled for a moment as the music carried over them, the conversation thinning without breaking completely. Danielle turned fully toward Sungil, closing the space himself this time, his knee angling in, his shoulder brushing lightly against Sungil's arm as he spoke. "Stay with me tonight. My place." Sungil didn't answer right away. He let the words sit, his expression steady, his hand still where it was as if nothing had shifted. He glanced once at Danielle's glass. "Still full," Sungil said. Danielle picked it up, took a short drink without looking away. Danielle leaned in again, closer this time, his voice lower. "You coming or not?" "You're in a hurry." Danielle didn't answer. He stayed close. Sungil held his gaze, then leaned in again, speaking near his ear this time. "Finish your drink." Danielle nodded once and drank. Jiho stepped back into the table, the guy from earlier close at his side. At the side of the table, Danielle was already turning away, one hand reaching for his jacket. Sungil stood close behind him, his hand brushing briefly at Daniel's back as he shifted. Jiho glanced between them, then back. "Going before me," Jiho said. Sungil looked at him. Jiho's mouth curved slightly. Sungil gave a small nod, already in motion. Daniel stepped away first. Sungil followed without hesitation. They didn't look back. Ray watched the movement, then turned slightly. Do-yoon was still beside him, his posture unchanged, his glass resting near his hand. "I'll be back," Ray said. Do-yoon nodded once. Ray stood, stepping away from the table. Jiho stayed where he was, the seat across now empty, the room moving around them as the table thinned. Ray stepped back from the urinal and moved to the sink, turning the tap on and running his hands under the water. He reached for a paper towel, drying them as he looked briefly at his reflection, then dropped it into the bin. He turned toward the door. It opened as he reached for it. Lucas stepped in. Ray paused. The space tightened as someone pushed him behind Lucas, the door swinging wider before catching. Ray shifted slightly to the side. Lucas did the same. For a second they were close, shoulders nearly touching. The door held between them. Lucas moved first, heading straight toward the urinals. Ray stayed where he was for a moment longer. Then he stepped out into the hall. The table filled, then cleared again. Jiho decided when it started and when it ended, pulling people in, letting them go without staying himself. Sungil kept what was in front of him, holding it long enough before stepping away on his own terms. Ray didn't move right away. His gaze followed them as they stepped out, then shifted back to the table, stopping briefly before returning to the glass in front of him. Nothing needed to be said. The night settled on its own. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End. The hallway outside the bathroom narrowed just enough to hold the sound differently, the music from the main floor pressing in without ever fully arriving, like it had to pass through something before it reached this part of the space. Ray stood just off the side of the door, not blocking it, not waiting in a way that would be noticed, but not moving either, as people passed through without stopping. One brushing his shoulder on the way in, another pushing past on the way out. Ray stayed where he was. When the door opened, and Lucas stepped out with one hand still near the handle, letting it fall shut behind him as he gazed lifted, and landed immediately on Ray. They both stopped, not far enough apart to need to close the space, but not close enough to call it anything yet. The distance holding between them in a way that felt already decided. The noise from the main room pulsed once into the hallway, and fell back again. Lucas didn't look away. Ray didn't either. Time didn't stretch so much as settle, the moment holding just long enough to register before it moved. Ray shifted first, just enough to remove what little space was left between them. Lucas didn't step back. For a second, nothing followed. Then Lucas reached out, his hand finding Ray's side without hesitation. The kiss landed directly. Ray met it as it was, his hand lifting briefly, catching at Lucas' wrist before settling there. Lucas held him closer. When Lucas pulled back, he did it cleanly, just enough to break contact without leaving anything unfinished. For a second, they remained where they were. The distance reset but altered, like something had passed through it. When the door opened behind them again, the interruption was enough to move the movement forward, someone stepping out and forcing the space to adjust. Lucas stepped aside first. Ray moved the other direction. They passed back into the main room without looking at each other again, the sound swallowing them immediately, the hallway closing behind them, as if nothing had happened there at all. The table hadn't changed. Do-yoon was still there, seated along the sofa, with one arm resting near the bottle. His glass set was in easy reach. He looked up the moment Ray stepped back into the space, his attention settling without hesitation. Ray slid in beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the back of the sofa holding them in the same line. Do-yoon registered it before his hand moved to the bottle. "We still have this," he said, lifting it slightly before pouring into Ray's glass first. Ray followed the motion without interrupting it, lifting the glass once it was set down. Do-yoon poured for himself next. The space settled again, people leaning in and out without staying. A voice passing briefly over Do-yoon's shoulder before disappearing. A hand brushing past Ray as someone crossed behind him. Across from them, a chair shifted. Lucas stepped into the space and sat down opposite, pulling the chair in without asking. The movement simple enough that it didn't interrupt anything, and still managed to change the balance of it. Do-yoon's gaze lifted. "You're back?" Lucas gave a small nod. "Yeah." Do-yoon's hand remained on the bottle. "You drinking?" Lucas glanced at it, then back. "Sure." The pour came without hesitation, the same clean motion as before. Nothing added, nothing withheld. Lucas let the glass sit in front of him, his hand resting near the edge of the table rather than reaching for it. Ray didn't look up. But when he did, Lucas was already looking at him. Ray met it for a second, then let it go first, his attention dropping back to his glass as he turned it once against the table before lifting it again. Beside him, Do-yoon leaned back slightly, his arm settling along the top of the sofa behind Ray, his body aligning in just enough to reduce the space, without making it a point. "To be honest," he said after a moment, his voice steady, directed at Ray, "I wasn't planning on staying much longer." Ray looked at him. Do-yoon held it. "We can head out. Somewhere quieter? Or just my place," Do-yoon said. The music passed in around them again, the bass carrying through the table, through the glass, through the space they were sitting in. Do-yoon leaned forward, topping off Ray's glass without asking. "Let's finish this first," he said. "Then we go." Lucas lifted his glass again, this time finishing it before setting it down, his gaze shifting once. Ray, then Do-yoon, as if the space no longer required him to hold it. Do-yoon stood already moving. "I'll close out." Ray stayed where he was. Lucas didn't look at him. He pushed his chair back and moved toward the bar, folding into the crowd without drawing attention, disappearing into the same way he had entered. Do-yoon returned, receipt in hand. "All set." Ray stood. Do-yoon stepped in beside him, his hand brushing lightly at Ray's back as they turned toward the exit. By the time the bartender glanced up, Lucas had already lifted his hand slightly, signaling. "One more whiskey." He finished the drink where he stood. The glass sat back down with the same quiet control, his attention drifting just enough to register someone stepping into his space. "Heading out?" the man asked. Lucas looked at him, held it for a second, then gave a small smile. Yeah, that was enough. They moved together without needing anything else to confirm it. Outside, the air felt less contained, the sound of music spilling out behind as the door closed. The street carrying its own rhythm now, cars passing, voices overlapping, the night continuing without needing the room to hold it. Do-yoon didn't slow until they reached the curb, lifting a hand as if the next step had already been decided. A car pulling in. He opened the door. Ray stepped in, the space closing around them as the taxi moved off again. The city sliding past in fragments of light that reflected briefly along the window. Do-yoon leaned back into the seat, his arm wrestling along the edge, angled just enough toward Ray to keep the space between them from opening too far. Elsewhere, Jiho stepped out into a hallway that felt quieter than it should have been. The key card already in his hand, Jiho stepped in with a man beside him. Sungil's door shut with a different kind of finality. He reached for Daniel almost immediately, his hand catching at his shirt, pulling him closer. Daniel followed easily, his body giving without resistance, meeting him without hesitation. The night spread outward from there, each of them stepping into a different version of it. The movement continuous, uninterrupted, one choice leading directly into the next. Nothing needed to be decided anymore, and once they moved into it, none of them looked back. The bathroom light cut a clean line into the room, steam still hanging in the air as Jiho stepped out with a towel low around his waist. On the bed, the guy had already fallen asleep, face turned into the pillow, one arm stretched across the empty space Jiho had left. Jiho looked at him before turning away and moving through the room, reaching for his clothes where they had been dropped. At the door, he paused just long enough to listen, then opened it and stepped out. By morning, the light had already filled the space, curtains half open. Lucas lay on his back, one arm folded beneath his head, the other resting loosely across his chest, his gaze unfocused. As the man moved around the room, pulling his shirt on, bending once to pick his phone up from the floor, the man nodded, like that was enough, and leaned slightly back toward the bed. Lucas turned his head, just not toward him. The door opened and closed. Lucas remained where he was. The light here was softer, filtered through curtains, the room still carrying the warmth of the night. Daniel lay close, one arm draped across Sungil's waist, his breathing deep and even. Sungil lay awake beneath it, his eyes open. After a moment, his hand adjusted slightly under Daniel's arm. He looked down once, taking in the details he hadn't noticed the night before. The relaxed line of his mouth, the absence of tension anywhere in his body, the ease of it all. He exhaled quietly through his nose, careful not to disturb the air between them. Ray woke to the movement rather than sound. The shift in the room subtle but enough to pull him back. Do-yoon was in the kitchen, moving easily through the space as he pulled something from the fridge and set it down, reaching for a pen. "You eat breakfast?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. Ray pushed himself up, leaning back against the headboard. Do-yoon's mouth curved faintly. "I'll make something quick." Ray watched him for a second. Then he moved. Do-yoon didn't turn. Not until Ray was already there. His hand came up automatically, settling at Ray's side, then around him, drawing him in just enough to keep him there without interrupting what he was doing. The boardroom was already half lit when Jiho stepped in, the main screen holding on a pause slide, with the title centered. Jiho's attention already on the screen. "Can we run it once?" The technician nodded, and the slide shifted forward, the sequence moving cleanly as Jiho watched, following the timing, the spacing. "Can you pause there?" The slide held, and he stepped a little closer. "Maybe lose the second line," he added. "It's a bit heavy." The technician glanced at it, then nodded. "I see what you mean." Jiho stepped back, shifting toward the podium where the mic rested on its stand. He picked it up, tapped it once, and listened as the sound came back through the speakers. "Sounds a bit high," he said. The technician adjusted it from the back, the change settling almost immediately. He spoke again, just enough to check. "Much better." His phone buzzed. "Sauna." Jiho's attention returned to the slide. "Is video ready?" "Of course. Can I see it?" The image settled. His phone buzzed again. He picked it up this time. "What time?" "After work." "7?" Jiho read it, his gaze lifting back to the screen for a moment before dropping again as another message came through. "Itaewon." Jiho held the phone in his hand. Then he typed, "What's the emergency?" He didn't wait for the reply, locking the screen and setting the phone down beside him, as if the question itself was enough for now. "Let's run it from the top again." The screen reset, the first slide coming back in, everything landing exactly where it was supposed to. His phone buzzed again, then once more. But Jiho didn't reach for it this time, his attention fixed on the sequence as it played through. The locker room held its usual warmth. Sungil was already there, seated with his elbow resting on his knees, a towel beside him. Jiho closed his locker, adjusting his sleeve once as he turned, while Ray stepped in last, dropping his bag and pulling his shirt off in one motion. Jiho's gaze passed over him, then slowed, catching near the collarbone. Is that a hickey? You scored last night? Ray didn't look down. Something like that. Jiho's mouth shifted. Sungil didn't ask. He was already standing. Come, he said, pushing off his knees. They followed. The main floor carried more noise, the television drawing a loose crowd, vending machines humming along the wall. But Sungil didn't slow there, pushing the door open into the heated room. He moved toward the center and dropped down, crossing his legs as he reached for the towel, folding it with quick, practiced movements before setting it onto his head, adjusting it once so it held. Jiho sat to the one side, Ray to the other. Sungil reached for Jiho's towel next. Come here. Jiho leaned in. Sit properly. Jiho shifted forward, just enough. Sungil folded it the same way, pressing it into place, giving it a small adjustment. Then he moved to Ray last, taking the towel, folding and placing it onto his head. Jiho's attention loosening as his gaze slid toward the far side of the room. Ray settling into the heat without offering anything further. Sungil snapped his finger once. Jiho's gaze came back immediately. Ray followed a second after. Sungil leaned forward, elbows on his knees. So, was Daniel last night? It was just fine, he said, like he was testing the words rather than stating them. A small pause followed, his jaw shifting slightly. Then he shook his head. He exhaled once, sharper this time. It was bad, he said more openly now. He leaned back slightly, one hand coming up to rub at back of his neck. I was below him, he continued. It started there. Then halfway through it switched, and I ended up on top of him. He let out a short breath. The heat pressed upward from the floor, holding the space in place. He was into it, Sungil added, glancing between them. I like him, he said after a moment. Quieter now, but clear. That's the part I don't get. Jiho shifted, his attention returning to Ray. So you're going to explain the hickey? Or we just pretending we didn't see it? Ray didn't react. Sungil let out a laugh, leaning back, the edge still there. Good for you, he said. See, I told you. You'll forget that Bali whatever. He waved it off lightly, like it didn't matter. Then leaned forward again, pulling the thread back toward himself. Anyway, he said quieter now. Am I doomed? Jiho didn't answer, his gaze flicking toward Ray. The signal passing. Ray caught it. He looked back at Sungil. You're overthinking it. Sungil held it for a second, then exhaled again. Ray's phone vibrated against the floor beside him. He glanced down and picked it up. The name on the screen was enough to register before he answered. Hey, Do-yoon spoke on the other line, Sungil's gaze flicking toward him once before drifting away. Jiho remained where he was. We just got here, Ray said, followed by a brief pause as he listened again. Tomorrow night. Another pause. That works. The conversation continued, and somewhere in the middle of it, Jiho turned his head slightly toward Sungil, catching his eyes with a small tilt that didn't need to be explained. The understanding passing cleanly between them as they rose almost at the same time. They stepped out of the room, leaving Ray where he was, still on the call. I can stop by. Ray went on. Your place is fine, he said after a beat. I'll text you. A short pause followed. See you tomorrow. He ended the call. Jiho and Sungil were already in the hot tub, shoulders submerged, the water barely moving until Ray stepped down and lowered himself in. Sungil's gaze dropped first, and stayed there without pretending otherwise. Wow, he said, shaking his head slightly. That's not fair. Jiho's mouth curved in response. That's what we're competing with, he added, neither of them breaking the moment as it landed. Ray leaned back into the water, letting it rise to his shoulders. Please don't start. Sungil leaned his head back, the laugh still there. Seriously, he went on, glancing toward Jiho as if to confirm the point rather than argue it. We're out here doing our best, and he's playing on easy mode. Jiho gave a small shrug. Well, that explains the hickey. You two done? Sungil's grin held. The earlier edge softened. Give us a minute, he said. We need to process. The water stilled once more, the steam folding it around them. They stayed there. And for now, that was enough. Some nights moved forward before anyone could stop them. Some choices felt decided the moment they were made. Jiho kept his distance, the way he always did, stepping in just enough to be part of it, never long enough to be held by it. Sungil tried to name what didn't fit, holding the moment in place until it showed him something back. Ray followed what felt right in the moment, even when it didn't point in one direction. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End. Chapter 3. The night continues. The studio main light had been turned off, leaving only the glow from the monitor and the soft spill from the lamp near the back wall. Ray sat angled toward the screen, one leg folded slightly under the chair, his hand resting near the trackpad as he moved through the images. He adjusted one slightly. His phone lit up beside him. He didn't reach for it right away. The screen dimmed once, then lit again, the vibration light against the table. He reached for the phone without breaking his line of sight on the screen. Jiho sent a photo, close up, too close to be accidental. His eyes angled toward the camera, one brow lifted. Do you guys see the wrinkle? Ray looked at it for a second, then typed back. No. The typing bubble appeared almost immediately. Look again. You're fine. A second message came in before he locked the phone. I swear it wasn't there last week. Ray let out a small breath. Then he set the phone down beside the keyboard and leaned forward, his gaze returning to the monitor. A runner mid-stride, foot just off the ground, body leaning forward without losing control. He zoomed in slightly, adjusted the crop. The phone lit once more. Sungil had joined. Ray, how's it going with Do-yoon? Ray rested his thumb against the edge of the phone. All good. Hey Sungil, do you see the wrinkle? You seeing him this weekend? Sungil ignored Jiho. Ray scrolled on through the image in the monitor. A moment passed. Then it buzzed again. We should do a double date. Ray shifted slightly in his chair. Guys, I'm working. On what? Sports model shoot. There was a brief pause. Then, when are you shooting me? Ray glanced at the screen again, then back to the phone. Next week. I'll find time. You've been saying that for months. I mean it. Let's find time. Good. I'll hold you to it. Sungil didn't push it further. Jiho cut back in. Hold on. See it now? Same angle, slightly different lighting. Ray looked at it longer this time, then typed. Still no. I'm booking a facial. You don't have a wrinkle. Ray set the phone down again, letting the conversation continue without him. The phone kept buzzing. He reached back again. I can do Saturday afternoon. Good. Double date it is. You guys figure it out. I'm out. Ray opened a new text. You free Saturday afternoon? He sent it to Do-yoon. The reply came faster than expected. I can make time. Ray held the screen a second longer, then typed. I'll text you the place. Sounds good. Ray didn't add anything else. The group chat continued underneath. Something from Sungil. But Ray didn't scroll back up. He locked the phone and set it down beside him. Do-yoon was there first in the restaurant. He stood when Ray approached. You're early, Ray said. Do-yoon nodded. I was nearby. The menu said open, though he didn't seem to be reading it. Sungil arrived a moment later, pushing through the door. Daniel followed just behind him. Did you guys start without me? Sungil said, already moving toward the table. You're just on time, Ray replied. That's disappointing. I was expecting the grill to be ready. He dropped into the seat across from Ray. Daniel sat beside him. Do-yoon opened the menu again. Is there anything you don't eat? He asked, glancing briefly at Ray before shifting his attention across the table. Daniel gave a small shake of his head. No, Sungil said. We're good. Do-yoon nodded and began ordering. He moved through it cleanly, naming dishes, adjusting portions, checking once more with Ray before finishing. Sungil leaned back, his attention already moving between them. So, he said, looking toward Ray. Who's the sports model? Ray glanced at him briefly. I can't open name. Fine. I'll see it when it's done. Sungil shifted toward Danielle. You've been busy. Just work, Danielle said. Nothing different. That sounds like a lie. It's not. The first dishes arrived. The grill was set in place between them, heat rising immediately as it was turned on. Plates followed, meat arranged cleanly, vegetables set to the side. Before anyone reached for it, Sungil spoke again. Don't tell me we're not drinking. He looked between them, then toward Danielle. Soju or makgeolli? Danielle didn't take long. Soju. Good. Do-yoon reached for the tongs. He placed the meat on the grill, adjusting it once so it lay flat. When the soju was placed on the table, Ray poured to each glass. Sungil raised his glass. One shot. Daniel lifted his as well. They drank. Sungil finished his in one go, setting the glass down with a soft tap against the table. Daniel didn't. He took a sip, then lowered the glass, leaving the rest. Sungil glanced at him. I don't usually drink it like that, Daniel said. Suit yourself. He poured again, this time only for himself. The meat had begun to brown at the edges. Sungil reached for the tongs first this time, turning one piece before it needed it, then shifting another slightly to the side. Not yet, Do-yoon said. Sungil glanced at him, then back at the grill. You do it then. He left it where it was. Daniel watched for a moment, then reached in, picking up the tongue without interrupting either of them. He turned one piece and cut it into bite-sized pieces. The food continued to cook. Sungil reached for a lettuce leaf, flattening against his palm as he added meat, a slice of garlic, something from the side dish. Halfway through, Daniel reached in beside him. The timing didn't align. Their hands crossed briefly over the same space. Sungil pulled back first, letting Daniel finish. Daniel built the lettuce some, folding it once, then again. He passed it across. It landed just short of Sungil's mouth. Sungil reached the rest of the way and took it. Daniel had already moved his hand back. As Sungil took a bite, a small drop slipped from the edge, not enough to notice until it landed. Not on the table, on Daniel's pants. Daniel looked down. He wiped once with the napkin, then set the napkin down. I'll be back. He stood as he said it. Sungil stayed where he was for a moment, his hand hovering near the grill before he set the tongs down. Then pushed his chair back. I'll go with him. No one stopped him. The sound of the grill remained the same. Ray picked up his glass, finishing what was left. Do-yoon looked at him. You seem to be a bit off. Ray reached for the edge of the table, adjusting one of the plates. It's just the next shoot. Stressing me out. Do-yoon held his gaze a second longer, then nodded. Eat first. Ray reached for the meat. Across from him, the empty seats remained where they had been. What remained of the table was minimal. Empty dishes, glasses pushed slightly out of place. The heat from earlier no longer rising the same way. Ray leaned back slightly, his hand resting near the glass as he looked across the table. Daniel hadn't moved much, his attention still on his pants. The stain was still there. Sungil shifted in his seat, then stood. Let's go change. Daniel nodded, pushing his chair back. As he stepped past Sungil, his hand settled briefly at Sungil's waist. Sungil didn't react to it. He turned back toward the table instead. We're going to change, he said. See you guys at the club. Ray gave a nod. Do-yoon did the same. There was nothing to hold them there longer. Ray and Do-yoon stepped out into the night. Ray glanced down the road, then toward the incline leading up. Do you want to go up to the old city wall? Do-yoon nodded once. They turned off the main street. Do-yoon reached for Ray's hand. Ray didn't pull away. He looked down briefly, then forward again. They walked like that for a while. The path curved upward, the city opening in pieces between the trees and the wall. They reached the wall and stopped. The skyline spread out below them. Ray rested his hand on the stone, looking out. When are you going to join me for a run? Do-yoon glanced at him. You still doing mornings? Weekends? Do-yoon considered it for a second. Tomorrow works. Good. Do-yoon turned slightly toward Ray, just enough to shift the angle. Ray followed it. The distance narrowed. From somewhere below, laughter carried up. Ray's gaze shifted first as he pulled back. Then he pushed off the wall, stepping back onto the path. Let's go. Jiho stood in front of the mirror, the bathroom light brighter than the rest of the apartment. The mask had already set across his skin, edges drawing near his jaw. He leaned in slightly, tilting his head just enough to check the line near his eye. He pressed lightly once, then let it go. His phone lit up on the counter. He glanced at it. He rinsed his hand first, drying them slowly before picking the phone up. Messages stacked, but nothing new that needed him. He locked the screen and set it back down, then reached for a towel, wiping the mask away in clean strokes. He moved into the bedroom, pulling a shirt from the rack. Something fitted, something sexy. He changed, adjusting the collar once, checked himself in the mirror. Then he smoothed it once with his hand. The line outside the club moved quickly. Ray stepped in first, Do-yoon just behind him, the music settling around them as the door closed. The club was already full. Lights moved across the space, catching briefly on faces. Ray scanned once. Lucas was there, near the bar, angled towards someone. His posture stayed easy, one hand resting against the counter, his attention moving in and out of what was in front of him. Lucas didn't look over. Ray moved toward an open table. Do-yoon followed, taking the seat beside him. 2 drinks came, placed down between them. Do-yoon lifted his glass first, taking a measured sip. Ray followed, slower. At the bar, Lucas shifted slightly, reaching into his pocket. He checked something briefly, then set it down on the counter in front of him. Jiho arrived a few minutes later. He spotted Ray easily, stepping into the space, his presence settling into the table, as if it had always been there. You're late, Ray said. Jiho glanced at him once, then toward Do-yoon, acknowledging both with a nod. He leaned back slightly, picking up his glass. So, he said, looking between them. How was the double date? Ray glanced at him and smiled, taking a sip of whiskey. Where the hell is Sungil? They went to change clothes. Jiho paused for a second. I don't want to know. He reached for the bottle, pouring. But he's coming, right? Yeah. Jiho lifted his glass, already done with it. The door opened, and Sungil came in. Daniel followed just behind him, his look reset, everything sitting clean and in place as if nothing had happened earlier. You miss me, Sungil said, dropping into the seat. Daniel didn't sit. He paused beside the table, his attention already shifting past them. Be right back. Sungil waved it off without looking. Daniel moved toward the bar. Ray's gaze followed. Daniel stepped in next to Lucas. Something passed between them. Then Lucas turned slightly, moving away from the bar. Daniel returned to the table, sliding into his seat as if nothing had interrupted the flow. Ray's gaze moved across the room and settled on Lucas moving. He was already walking toward the exit. Lucas was already moving through the crowd when Ray set his glass down and stood, saying he wasn't feeling well, just loud enough for the table to hear. Sungil paused mid-sentence, half turning toward him. You what? Jiho only glanced once, not questioning it. Go, before you make it worse. Do-yoon was already up, falling into step beside Ray. Was there something at the dinner? Ray nodded. They moved through the crowd, the table closing behind them as if nothing had shifted. By the time they reached the door, Lucas was near the exit. Ray picked up his pace, the music cutting off for a second as the door opened. Lucas was a few steps ahead when Ray cut up. Hey! Lucas stopped and turned. Heading out? Yeah. The door opened again, behind them as Do-yoon stepped out. And for a moment, the three of them stood there. Do-yoon looked between them, not asking, not interrupting. Ray let out a breath, then said it simply. Aren't you near where I am? Lucas held his gaze a second, then nodded. A taxi slowed at the curb, Do-yoon lifting a hand as it pulled in. He opened the door and got in first, Ray following without breaking stride, and Lucas sliding in after them, the door closing as the taxi pulled away from the curb. The taxi moved steadily once it pulled away, the city passing in layers of light and shadows across the window. Do-yoon sat forward, his gaze moving between the road ahead. At some point, Do-yoon reached across, his hand finding Ray's. Ray didn't pull away. Lucas noticed, shifting slightly, as his leg pressed closer against Ray's. Taxi slowed at light and came to a stop. Do-yoon reached for the handle, then paused just enough to turn toward Ray. Call me in the morning. We can postpone the run. Ray looked at him. Hope you get better. Thanks. He stepped out, the door closing behind him as the taxi pulled forward again. The space between Ray and Lucas shifting as the car moved on. Ray didn't turn, but his hand moved once along the seat, stopping where the gap between them had been. Lucas' hand was already there. Ray placed his hand over it. Lucas looked at him. The taxi slowed and pulled to the side. Lucas stepped out first, Ray right after him. The door closing behind them as someone brushed past, shoulder catching lightly against Ray's, before continuing on. Sorry, the voice said, already closing the door. The taxi pulled off. Ray turned toward Lucas. Stay tonight at my place. Lucas held his gaze, then nodded. Ray didn't slow as he crossed the apartment entrance, pushing the door open and heading inside, Lucas following without needing to be told. The lobby held just enough light to see by. Ray moved straight to the elevator and pressed the button, his hand dropping back to his side as they waited. When the door opened, they stepped in together, the space narrowing around them, close enough that neither of them adjusted. The door slid shut. Ray turned, the words already there before he decided whether to say them. Lucas didn't let him finish. No need. The distance closed in the same breath, Ray's hand catching at Lucas's collar, pulling him in as the kiss landed. Lucas met it just as directly, his hand coming up along Ray's side, holding there as the lift continued to move. The door slid open again. The kiss broke on the moment. Ray stepped out first. Lucas followed, the hallway empty, the pause between them not holding long enough to settle. Ray moved without slowing, unlocking the door and pushing it open. As he stepped inside, Lucas came in behind him. The door closed. Ray turned back to Lucas. This time, nothing interrupted it. Some moments didn't slow down once they began. Some choices didn't wait to be explained. Do-yoon stayed steady, moving forward the way things were meant to go. Lucas didn't push anything forward, holding his place, letting things come to him without needing to name them. Ray stopped adjusting to what was in front of him, choosing instead to move toward what didn't fit. They crossed the same night, just not in the same direction. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End. Chapter 4. The Night Turns. Ray was still half asleep, his head resting against Lucas' shoulder, the room holding the quiet weight of a night that hadn't fully cleared. The phone on the nightstand had been vibrating for a while. Lucas looked down at Ray. Your phone, he said. Ray let out a slow breath and reached across the bed, his hand brushing along the sheet until he found the phone, his eyes adjusting as he looked at the screen. Shit. Do-yoon. Missed calls stacked one after another, with a message sitting beneath them. Ray pushed himself up, running a hand through his hair as the phone lit again in his hand. Lucas was already sitting up beside him, reaching for his shirt. I should go. Ray looked at him, still holding the phone. No, don't. He reached out, his hand catching Lucas's wrist. The contact firmer now. Lucas paused. He looked down at Ray's hand, then back at him. You've got things to take care of, he said. I know. Another vibration in his hand, the phone lighting against between them. Ray didn't look at it. Don't go. Not right now. The room stayed still around them, the moment no longer passing on its own. Lucas held his gaze for a second longer than before, then glanced briefly at the phone. Ray's grip didn't shift. Lucas let out a slow breath, the decision settling without needing to be said. He didn't pull his hand back, didn't move toward the door. Instead, he set the shirt down again. The phone buzzed once more. Ray still didn't answer. In another house, the space carried the weight of something that had just ended. Daniel lay back against the pillow, one arm draped across Sungil's waist, his breathing already slowing. Sungil didn't move. He stayed where he was, his palm resting flat against the mattress. You're done? He asked. Daniel turned his head slightly. With what? Sungil shifted just enough to look at him, his expression steady but not relaxed. With this? Daniel exhaled once, like he understood what Sungil was asking, even if he didn't fully agree with it. It was good, he said. Sungil held his gaze. That's it? Daniel's expression didn't change much. He reached for Sungil, pulling him in. Hey, he said. I like you, but I can't match your energy like that. Sungil looked at him, searching for something that wasn't there, then let his gaze drift upward to the ceiling. Daniel didn't move away, didn't try to shift it into something else. Sungil let out a slow breath, his chest rising once before settling again. His body still close, but no longer in it the same way. Daniel's arm remained around him, the hold steady, like that was enough. Sungil didn't push him off. He just stayed there, looking up, the moment already over for one of them, and not fully finished for the other. Do-yoon had been in the cafe long enough for the cup of coffee to cool. His running shoes were still clean, his jacket still on, his phone resting face up beside the cup. Minja slid into the seat across from him. Did you wait long? He said. The traffic was shit. Sorry about it. Do-yoon gave a small nod, his posture unchanged. It's fine. Minja leaned back, his eyes moving over Do-yoon. What happened? Nothing. The answer came easily, without explanation. You were supposed to meet him, right? Do-yoon didn't answer immediately, not because he was avoiding it, but because there wasn't anything to add. Minja exhaled lightly. Did you call him? He didn't answer. He didn't even text back. Minja shifted forward this time, resting his arms on the table. What's going on with you two? Do-yoon reached for the water, took a small sip. Nothing. Minja let out a short breath through his nose. Come on. His attention drifted briefly toward the window, and then returned. I think I saw him last night. Do-yoon looked up. Minja continued without building it up, like it wasn't meant to land any particular way. A taxi pulled up near the curb. I was walking past. He got out with someone. I didn't see the other guy properly. Do-yoon held his gaze for a moment longer, then said, Oh, we were in the same taxi. I got off earlier. Minja looked at Do-yoon, but they were close. Could have just been the angle, but it looked like they were holding hands. Do-yoon's attention shifted to the phone beside his cup. The screen stayed dark. The table was already half occupied by the time Ray arrived, the music carrying low enough to sit beneath conversations without breaking it, the light catching along the edges of glasses, and hands as people moved around them. Jiho was the first to look up, his attention snapping into place as soon as Ray stepped in, a brief smile crossing his face before he leaned back in his seat. Get your butt down here. Ray slid into the empty seat next to him, his jacket still on, his gaze moving once across the table. Sungil was already there, one arm resting along the back of his chair. His posture relaxed in a way that usually meant he was holding the space easily. Though tonight, there was a slight delay in how he followed the conversation, his attention catching a fraction later than it should have. Danielle sat beside him, angled just enough toward the table to stay present. His expression calm, his responses measured, nothing in his tone shifting even when Sungil pushed the rhythm forward. Jiho stood without warning. "I'll be right back." He moved through the room, weaving between people like he belonged to every part of it. Near the bar, Do-yoon stood with Minjae, the two of them positioned slightly apart from the crowd. Jiho approached them, his presence filling the space without effort. "What are you doing over here?" he said, his tone light. "Not joining the table?" Do-yoon didn't answer, his posture shifting slightly as Jiho stepped closer. "I'm fine here." Jiho didn't take the hint. He reached out, catching Do-yoon's wrist. "Come on." Minjae moved before Do-yoon did, his hand coming up to stop Jiho's, catching his wrist mid-motion. "Hey!" The contact was brief. But in the small adjustment that followed, the thin thread around Minjae's wrist pulled tight and snapped. Jiho let go immediately. "Sorry." He stepped back without waiting, the moment already passing for him. Minjae glanced down at his wrist, the loose thread shifting against his skin. Do-yoon remained where he was, his attention moving once between them. Jiho gave a short nod and turned. Back at the table, Sungil leaned forward, his focus narrowing toward Danielle as he picked up the thread again. "Don't drink too much," he said. "I want you sober for tonight." Danielle glanced at him, then at the drink in his own hand, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "I'm fine," he said. Sungil held his gaze for a second. "I need you to hold it tonight." The words sat between them, clear this time. Danielle nodded once, like he understood. "Sure." A brief pause followed, just long enough to feel like something might settle. Then Danielle picked up his glass, finished what was left. "I'm getting another," he said as he turned toward the bar. Sungil didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to adjust. Lucas stood near the bar, one hand resting loosely around his glass. Danielle slowed as he reached the counter. He stepped in beside Lucas. "Hey." Lucas gave a small nod, acknowledging him without shifting position. The bartender came up beside them. Danielle glanced at him. "I'm good," he said. The bartender gave a small nod and moved on. Danielle let out a quiet breath, his shoulder easing slightly, like the space gave him a moment to reset. "I think I need something stronger tonight." Lucas looked at the glass in front of him, then at Danielle, taking him in more clear this time. Danielle gave a small nod, his gaze dropping briefly before lifting again, just to keep up. He didn't look at Lucas when he said it. Lucas didn't react immediately. He held his gaze on him for a second, not questioning it. "You don't have to," he said. Danielle let out a short breath through his nose, something close to a smile, but without much behind it. He glanced back toward the table. Sungil wasn't there. Danielle straightened slightly, his eyes moving across the space, like he might have missed him for the first time. He looked once more. Nothing. His hand came off the counter. "Hold on," he said, already stepping away before Lucas could respond. Jiho slipped back into the movement of the room, like nothing had shifted, his hand already closing around his glass as he settled into a space between conversations, his attention moving easily from one point to the next. The night still felt open, the kind that didn't require decisions, just movement. "Hey, Jiho." The voice came from behind him, close enough that he didn't need to turn to know it was meant for him. He paused, then looked over his shoulder. The guy from a few nights ago stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other resting loosely at his side. "You've been ignoring my calls." Jiho looked at him for a second. "I've been busy." "If you're not, move on," Jiho said. The words landed clean, leaving no space for adjustment. For a second, the guy held his gaze, like he was deciding whether to push it further. Then he turned and disappeared back into the crowd. Jiho watched him go for half a second, then turned back, already letting it pass. Nothing in him shifted, or at least, nothing that showed. He took a sip from his glass and moved again, his attention already redirecting, scanning the room the way he always did, picking up who was looking, who might follow, where the night could go next. Near the far side of the floor, someone caught his eye. He adjusted his pass slightly, angling toward it. The other guy noticed, the glance holding just long enough to confirm it before turning fully. Jiho didn't stop until they were already within reach. The exchange was brief, easy, the kind that didn't need anything built around it. A few words passed between them, nothing that carried beyond the moment, just enough to settle the direction. Jiho let his hand rest lightly on the other man's waist as they turned together. Do-yoon's attention shifted toward the table before anything was said, his gaze settling there just long enough to take in what had changed. Minjae followed it a beat later, his eyes moving in the same direction, reading the space. Ray was there alone. Do-yoon held the glance for a moment longer, then looked away. "You're not going back?" Minjae asked. "Give me a minute." Minjae gave a small nod, like that was enough. Ray didn't notice Do-yoon at first. The chair across from him shifted, and he looked up to find Do-yoon standing there. "Hey." Ray nodded once. "Hey." Do-yoon didn't sit immediately. He held the space for a second, taking in the table, the empty seats, the way the night had rearranged itself, then lowered himself into the chair. The music carried between them, low enough to fill the silence without pressing on it. Do-yoon glanced once toward the bar, then back at Ray. "You didn't answer my call." Ray didn't answer. Do-yoon let the silence stretch, then said, without raising his voice, "You don't have the guts to tell me." Ray's expression shifted slightly, something tightening. "I didn't plan it," he said. Do-yoon gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "No," he said quietly. "You just let it happen." Ray didn't respond. Do-yoon held his gaze a moment longer, then leaned back just slightly, like the decision had already been made before the conversation began. "I'm making my choice." Ray watched him. Do-yoon stood, his chair sliding back quietly against the floor, the sound disappearing under the music. "Take care." Do-yoon didn't look back as he moved away, the space closing behind him as easily as it had opened. Ray stayed where he was, his posture unchanged, though something in it had already shifted. For a moment, nothing around him moved differently. Then the music returned in full, and the room carried on, the movement of the night filling in what had just ended, leaving no visible trace of it. Daniel cut back through the crowd, his attention fixed ahead as the table came back into view. Ray was still there. He stepped beside the table, his eyes moving once across the empty seats before settling on Ray. "Did you see Sungil?" Ray shook his head. "No." Daniel held that for a brief moment, like he was confirming what he already knew. He turned and moved back through the crowd, the direction of his movement now clear, his focus narrowing as he headed for the exit. Outside, the air felt cooler against his skin, the noise of the club falling behind him as he stepped onto the pavement. He pulled his phone out while walking, dialing without slowing, his gaze moving along the street as if Sungil might still be somewhere within reach. The call rang out, and when unanswered, he let it drop, then tried again, pacing once toward the curb, his shoulder tightening slightly as he listened. Still nothing. A car passed, then another, their headlights lighting across the pavement as he lowered the phone for a second, thinking, then lifted his hand toward the street. A taxi slowed. Daniel stepped forward and pulled the door open. Inside the club, the music continued, the rhythm of the room unchanged for anyone who hadn't been part of the table. Ray remained where he was, the chair across from him still slightly angled out. Left that way by the last person who had stood. Jiho returned not long after, accompanied. His presence as easy as it had been all night. The rhythm of the room still working around him the way it always did. He slowed when he saw the table, his eyes taking in the empty seats before landing on Ray. What happened? Ray didn't answer. Jiho held a silence for a moment, then glanced at the guy beside him. Not tonight, babe. Let's do next time. The guy nodded once and stepped away. Jiho slid into the seat beside Ray, the sofa dipping slightly under the shift as he settled in. He reached for the glass that had been left there, turning it once in his hand. He leaned back, his arm resting along the back of the sofa, his hand brushing lightly against Ray's shoulder as it settled there, the contact brief and unmarked. Sauna tomorrow? 7? Ray nodded once. Sounds good. Jiho gave a small nod and pulled his phone out, his thumb moving across the screen as he opened the group chat. Where the hell are you? We're planning sauna tomorrow at 7. He sent it and let the phone rest in his hand. The music carried on around them. Lucas crossed the edge of the room toward the exit. Ray's attention lifted without thinking, following him just long enough to register it. The door opening and closing as Lucas stepped out. Jiho caught the shift. He reached for the bottle instead, pouring into the 2 glasses with an easy practice motion, setting one in front of Ray and keeping the other. I passed on my night for your shit, he said. A faint curve at the corner of his mouth. You better make it worth it. Ray let out a quiet breath, his hand moving toward the glass. Jiho's phone buzzed. He glanced down, then angled the screen slightly toward Ray. I was about to ask you guys for it. Why not now? Ray looked at it. Then he let out a short laugh. Jiho followed, the sound easy, unforced, breaking just enough of the weight that had been sitting there. Jiho typed back with one hand. Ray and I am in. He sent it and set the phone aside. They picked up their glasses at the same time, finishing what was left without saying anything more. Then Jiho pushed himself up, the sofa shifting as he stood. Ray followed. Around them, the night continued, unchanged. Some moments didn't slow down once they began. Sungil stepped away before anything could be settled, choosing distance over staying where it no longer met him. Danielle kept moving, trying to catch something that had already slipped out of reach, not realizing yet where it had broken. Do-yoon stayed steady, drawing a line where it made sense to stop, already facing what came after. Lucas didn't push anything forward, holding his place, letting things come to him without needing to name them. Jiho moved through the night the way he always did, keeping it light, not yet feeling the shift that had already begun. Ray stopped adjusting to what was in front of him, choosing instead to move toward what didn't fit. They crossed the same night, but not in the same direction. Thank you for listening to Where Nights Don't End. Chapter 5. The Night That Ended. Ray leaned back, the heat already settled in. Sungil sat forward with his elbows on his thigh, head lowered just enough to show he hadn't let the night go. Jiho, with one knee turned outward, his attention moving back and forth, like he was waiting for someone to say it first before he did. He didn't wait long.
What happened with you two?
Sungil exhaled.
I told him not to drink.
Jiho glanced at him.
It's a club.
The reaction immediate. Ray turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on Jiho. Sungil dragged a hand down his face.
It's not just the drink.
So you're into him. Then what's the problem? In bed, it's still not working.
Not working? Man, if that was me, I'd pull my pants up and walk out mid.
Sungil let out a quiet huff.
Show him how you want it. Tell him straight. He'll either meet you there or he won't.
Sungil let that sit.
That was the plan tonight.
Jiho turned his head toward Ray.
And you? What's going on with you?
Ray didn't move.
Don't do that here. We're not at the table.
Jiho leaned forward, not letting it slide this time. Ray exhaled.
When I got back, you were just sitting there alone.
I ended it with Do-yoon.
There wasn't much there to end.
I'm not talking about Do-yoon. I'm asking about Lucas.
Lucas?
Sungil turned toward Ray immediately, the reaction sharp now that it was named.
You think I didn't see it?
Jiho didn't ease off. Ray glanced at him, but didn't answer. Jiho continued.
You don't look at someone for no reason.
Sungil shifted closer.
Since when? It's not like that.
Jiho laughed.
Yes, it is.
Sungil watched Ray more closely now.
Shit, I thought I was in drama. What did I miss?
Jiho leaned back a fraction.
So what is it?
Ray looked at him this time, not avoiding it. Sungil shifted slightly, the edge gone now that it was clear what they were actually talking about.
At least make it interesting.
Ray leaned his head back against the wood. The heat held, softening the edges of whatever he said next. As Sungil leaned in slightly, and Jiho tilted his head to catch it. The three of them settling into the way they always did. The door opened behind them, and someone stepped in, cooler air slipping through the room for a moment. But none of them looked over, their attention staying where it was, as their voices continued. Steam clung to the mirrors after the showers. Ray stepped back to his locker, towel low at his waist, water still tracing down his shoulders. Sungil was already there, pulling a shirt over his head, while Jiho stood off to the side. Ray unlocked his phone.
You with Daniel?
The reply came a moment later from Lucas.
No. Why?
Ray's thumb paused once.
I'm with Sungil at Itaewon sauna. Think he should come by.
I'll check on Daniel.
Ray locked the screen and set the phone down like that was enough. By the time he was dressed, Sungil was still working a towel through his hair.
You feeling better now?
Jiho looked up, glancing between them. Sungil shrugged, pulling his shirt down properly.
Much better.
Jiho nodded once, like that tracked.
You guys still drink these? Get me one. What about you, Jiho?
I'm watching my diet.
Jiho shook his head. Ray let out a small laugh as he pressed the button, then another, the machine humming before dropping the banana milk one by one. Jiho watched them amused. Ray pushed the straw through the top and took a drink. They drifted toward the low table near the vending machine. Sungil leaned back against the edge, one foot hooked lightly under the table. He glanced between them, something lighter breaking through.
You guys are my family. Don't start.
Jiho didn't even let it land. Ray let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting.
I turned down a guy for you two tonight. So you both owe me. Big time.
Jiho watched them for a second.
All right. What do you want?
Sungil shifted his weight, watching Jiho.
You just take care of Daniel.
This weekend, I'll plan something.
Ray cut in. Sungil tilted his head.
The three of us.
Ray looked at him like that should have been obvious.
We better not.
But Jiho cut in immediately, shaking his head. Sungil frowned.
Why?
Because it never ends with just the three of us. So true. Never.
Three stepped out. Jiho moved first, like he always did, already adjusting his pace to the street. Just off to the side, near the edge of the sidewalk, two figures stood angled toward each other. Daniel and Lucas. Sungil slowed first. Daniel noticed him before the others, his attention lifting cleanly, his body already turning. Lucas followed a second later. Ray stopped a few steps short. Jiho didn't.
Perfect. I'm off.
He glanced once between them.
Where are you going?
Somewhere that doesn't involve relationship counseling.
Jiho shrugged, already stepping past them.
I'm sorry.
Daniel stepped forward, his hand landing briefly at Sungil's arm. Before pulling him in, Sungil returned it just as easily. On the other side, Ray looked at Lucas.
I didn't expect you here.
Lucas held his gaze.
You asked.
Ray nodded once,
You want to walk?
He tilted his head slightly toward the street. Lucas shifted, stepping in the direction Ray had already chosen. Behind them, Sungil and Daniel stayed close as they moved the opposite way. Ray turned into the side street with Lucas beside him, the choice already made between them.
You didn't have to set that up. It's easier that way.
Lucas glanced at him once. Ray looked ahead.
Was that all? No.
Lucas held that for a beat, satisfied enough. They kept walking. Behind them, on the opposite stretch of road, Sungil and Daniel drifted toward the darker side of the block. Daniel slowed first, then stopped, his hand catching at Sungil's wrist and turning him toward the wall beside a shuttered storefront. Sungil went with it, his back meeting the wall, the space between them closing. Daniel leaned in. The kiss landed hard. One hand braced beside Sungil's shoulder. People passed along the far edge of the pavement, a couple of glances turning and then moving on.
My place? Yeah.
Ray and Lucas reached the edge of the intersection. They stepped into the light together, the pace picking back up as the street folded them in, the night continuing without needing anything else from it. Ray's phone lit up on the counter.
You need anything?
Ray glanced at it, then typed back.
I'm good.
Ray set the phone down, reaching for the stack of plates. Sungil stood near the entrance of Daniel's place, one hand adjusting the cuff of his sleeve.
Hold still.
He fixed the line of Sungil's collar, smoothing it once. Sungil led him. Daniel finished what he was doing before stepping back a fraction.
Better.
Sungil huffed. Jiho stood in front of the mirror, a facial mask set cleanly across his face, one hand adjusting the edge near his cheek as he checked the reflection. His phone sat just within reach. He glanced at it, then picked it up long enough to scroll once before setting it back down. Lucas stood at the flower shop. He looked over the arrangements in front of him.
Something specific?
The florist asked.
That one.
Lucas shook his head, already decided. The doorbell rang. Jiho was already leaning slightly against the frame outside, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his phone.
You're early?
Ray opened the door,
First time for everything.
glancing around the space as he moved further in.
Not bad.
Jiho took in the setup, the table, the drinks, the way everything was already in place. Ray shook his head slightly,
You want something?
turning back toward the kitchen.
Surprise me.
Jiho followed a step behind. Ray reached for a glass, pouring without asking further, setting it down within reach. Jiho picked it up,
You good?
taking a small sip before glancing back toward the table again.
I'm fine.
Jiho let that sit for a second. Ray glanced at him.
Don't start.
Jiho let out a short breath.
I'm not starting anything. Just making sure you don't.
He set the glass down, shifting his weight. Ray didn't answer that.
I'll use the bathroom.
Jiho looked around once more, then pushed off the counter. He headed down the short hallway. The bathroom light clicked on. He stepped in, glancing once at himself in the mirror. Something caught his eye. A bracelet, resting near the corner of the sink. Jiho picked it up, turning it once between his fingers. A brief image flickered, a hand pulling away, something slipping loose and gone.
Hey?
Ray didn't answer immediately, but a second later he stepped into the doorway.
What? Where did you get this?
Jiho lifted the bracelet slightly. Ray looked at it,
Bali.
then back at Jiho.
You know Min-jae?
Jiho held it there for another second.
Do-yoon's friend?
Yeah.
Ray shook his head once.
Not really.
Sorry, bro. Shouldn't have brought him up.
Ray didn't answer. Jiho turned the tap, rinsing his hands. He dried them, then stepped past Ray back into the apartment, like nothing had shifted. The doorbell rang again.
Something smells good.
Sungil said as he stepped in. Daniel followed a second later, his hand brushing lightly at Sungil's back as he passed.
Get your butt here and help.
Grab the plates. All right.
Sungil moved straight toward the kitchen.
Over there.
Jiho pointed toward the counter. Sungil rolled his eyes, but reached for the stack anyway, passing one across to Danielle. Ray moved between them and the table, picking things up, settling them down. The doorbell rang again. Lucas stood outside, one hand at his side, the other holding a small wrapped bundle.
I didn't know what you liked.
Ray looked at it for a second,
You didn't have to.
then back at him. Lucas gave a small shrug, then stepped in, his hand coming up briefly at Ray's shoulder in a light greeting. Ray stepped aside to let him in. Jiho saw it, his gaze moving once between them. Sungil caught it a second later, the corner of his mouth lifting briefly before he looked away. Lucas set the flower near the edge of the counter.
Where's the vase?
Sungil slowed just enough to reach for the bundle, glancing toward Ray.
Second shelf. Bottom cabinet.
Sungil nodded once and turned toward the sink, setting the wrapping outside before opening the cabinet and pulling out a glass vase. He ran a bit of water into it, then placed the flowers in and turned them once, checking how they sat.
Drinks?
Danielle looked up as Lucas stepped closer. Sungil carried the vase over, setting it near the center of the table. Jiho straightened slightly and looked over at the food.
I'm starving, guys.
Sungil glanced at him.
I thought you were watching your diet.
Shut up.
Jiho said as he pulled out a chair. Ray glanced once around the table, then sat. Dinner finished in pieces, plates left where they landed. Sungil leaned back first, one arm wrestling along the back of his chair, Danielle close beside him. Across from them,
There was this guy I met a few weeks ago.
Jiho looked at his drink,
I think he's playing my game.
like he had just remembered.
That sounds like a problem.
Sungil glanced at him.
He just snatched a guy right in front of me.
Jiho shook his head. Ray looked at him.
In front of you?
He didn't even look at me.
Jiho lifted his glass, a small, easy motion.
And?
Danielle glanced over. Jiho let a breath out, half a laugh.
And now I'm curious.
You're always curious.
Sungil smirked. Jiho tilted his head.
Maybe I'm getting old?
Everyone laughed. The conversation folded back into smaller things after that. At some point, the table began to clear. Plates and glasses gathered. Sungil pushed his chair back and reached for the first stack. Ray was already up, stepping in before he could carry them off.
Leave it. You've done enough.
Sungil dropped back into his chair, reaching for his drink instead. Ray carried the plates into the kitchen. Water ran. Plates shifted from one hand to the other, the space narrowing, the rhythm of it steady. Ray reached for another plate. Lucas' hand caught his wrist lightly before he did. Enough to stop him. Ray looked at him. Lucas didn't say anything. He just pulled him a fraction closer. The kiss was brief, just enough to settle something that had already been there. From the other side, Jiho saw it. Sungil leaned forward, glancing between them like he had been waiting for a moment to cut in.
We should take a photo.
He said.
All of us.
Jiho glanced over.
Now? Why not? Hey, you two, come. Photo time.
They gathered, Danielle stepping in beside him. Jiho adjusted his position slightly, and Lucas settled near Ray,
Everyone in?
angling the phone.
Just take it.
Jiho said. Sungil lifted it, then lowered it slightly. He looked between Ray and Lucas.
No, wait, hold on. You two? Closer. Oh, come on. Everyone here knows you guys kissed in the kitchen.
Ray shifted just enough, closing the gap. Lucas matched it. Sungil nodded, satisfied. He lifted the phone again, a soft click. He checked it once, then turned the phone toward Danielle.
Babe, can you take a photo of us?
Danielle took it without comment.
Gio, Ray, come here.
Jiho groaned under his breath, stepping in beside Ray while Sungil shifted closer.
Ready? Just take it!
Jiho said again. Another click. That was enough.
All right. Enough of this. We going to the club or what?
Jiho stepped back first. He glanced toward the door, already reaching for his jacket. Sungil laughed. Danielle fell in beside him. their shoulders brushing as they moved.
You two coming?
He called back.
Yeah.
Ray nodded once. Jiho grinned.
Don't take too long.
Ray reached for his jacket. Lucas waited. They stepped out together, the door closing behind them as the night folded back in. Lucas' hand found Ray's. Ray's fingers closed around his. Some moments didn't need to be held in place once they began. Some choices didn't wait to be explained.
I love you. I love you too.
Sungil stopped holding things back, meeting them where they stood instead of waiting for them to change. Danielle didn't hesitate this time, closing the distance without needing to question it. Jiho kept it light, but saw more than he let on, letting things settle without pulling them apart. Lucas didn't wait, stepping in without asking, holding what was already there, and Ray didn't adjust to it, choosing instead to stay where it led. By the end, nothing had been said, but something had already been decided. Somewhere else, the room was dim. Minjae lay half asleep on his side, the sheets pulled low, one arm tucked beneath his head. Beside the bed, Ryan stood for a moment, looking down at his phone, typed.
Hi, it's Ryan. Remember me?
He watched the screen for a second, then set the phone down. This brings you the full story of Where Nights Don't End. It exists in the same universe as Same Name Wrong Bag, following Ray after his time in Bali. If you'd like to experience the story before this, you can find Same Name Wrong Bag in the description. And Ryan's story? It will unfold soon.
Do-yoon here. Didn't expect the attention, but looks like I'm getting my own story. Right on time. New neighbor.
YouTube membership is now open. Behind the closed door is a paid space with early access to stories before they are released. I've also been sharing behind-the-scenes thoughts, character layers, and extra writing over on Substack by alexo.substack.com. You'll find the links in the description if you'd like to check it out. I love to see you guys there. Thank you.